Welcome to this edition of Rhodes Ahead, our showcase of thought leadership in the Rhodes Scholar community. And I'm really delighted to be joined today and to be in conversation with Sir John Bell. He is the Regius Professor of Medicine at Oxford. He is Magdalen and Alberta 1975. And he has had truly a remarkable career as an immuno-geneticist, and I'll be asking him a bit about that, as an architect, one of the chief architects of Oxford Medical Sciences, which is currently ranked #1 in the world, and I want to ask you about that. He's also launched companies. He has been the president of the Academy of Medical Sciences. So you've led in so many ways, John. And I'm personally grateful that you are also a Rhodes Trustee. And so we love having the opportunity to work with you. So welcome to Rhodes Ahead.
Thank you very much. Yeah, delighted to be here.
Thank you. Thank you. So first, I just wanted to, if you could just tell us a little bit about your work in immunogenetics, and maybe even just think about kind of what you were thinking about as a Rhodes Scholar, and then how the questions you have engaged with have evolved over time.
I think one of the things it's worth reflecting on is that I've had the huge privilege of operating in academic medicine over what I suspect is one of its most fertile periods. So the success of the activity I've been involved in, and it's not me, it's been a whole cadre of people all over the world, have really delivered remarkable benefits for humans all over the world. For example, in this country, since I was a medical student, so that's 30-some years ago, I won't tell you exactly how many, but it was a long time ago, but not that long, we've reduced cardiovascular mortality in the UK by 70%. Wow. So 7 of the 10 people who drop dead of a coronary don't drop dead of a coronary anymore. And the same numbers in the US and in most Western countries. We've developed all kinds of novel therapies. There's now new therapies for inflammatory disease. There are 5 new drugs for multiple sclerosis. There is a way now to treat and maintain people with HIV and stable disease. You can cure hepatitis C virus. I mean, there's a whole catalog of these things. It's just a remarkable story. And at the heart of that is a really successful research community that has discovered the mechanisms of diseases and then developed therapies for it. So that it's been a huge privilege, and it hasn't been me. This is lucky. This is just serendipity. You land in an interesting place. So my 2 main interests over my research career have been genetics and immunology, and I spent 5 years with Hugh McDevitt at Stanford in the 1980s. And Hugh was a great thinker and was right at the forefront of both those subjects. He came from a very strong immunology background, but his fundamental interest was the genetics of immune response. And so I actually grew up in that environment with Hugh when I was a fellow there. And at the end of that, I decided that I would come back to the UK because there were opportunities to do things here. And in particular, it was clear that although in 1988 when I came back, nobody had even really got going on sequencing the human genome and all the genetics that followed with that, it was clear that there was going to be a revolution in those things over the next 10 or 15 years, and to be part of that was going to be very exciting. So I came back here at a time when research funding became much more accessible, and that the UK began to think about some really interesting big projects in that space. So I've been very involved in developing the genetic infrastructure in the UK that's now allowed us, I think, to probably lead the world in our large-scale genetic activities. And my interest within genetics was trying to understand better the mechanisms of immunological disease, but I had a wider interest in how do you get genetics to be done at scale. So that's really what I've spent the last 30 years doing, is trying to work out those details. And the outputs have been terrific. So, for example, I was the architect of a big project called UK Biobank, which is 500,000 people collected in the UK, in whom we're now sequencing the genomes of all 500,000 people. It's the biggest sequencing project on the planet, and that's emerged after 15 years of work, led by Rory Collins in Oxford. So it's been that's been a great success story. And I also led with the development of Genomics England, which is the world's first genome sequencing program in a healthcare system. So the NHS now will sequence routinely the genomes of people who've got a wide variety of different diseases. So those have been that has really played out, the genetics thing has really played out in a remarkable way. And I think the UK has developed most of the major methodologies for sequencing DNA. It's got the largest scale studies. It's now migrated into the healthcare system. We're the leaders in that space. So alongside that comes the insights into immunological disease that you get from the genetics.
Right.
And again, I've been very fortunate because there's been a revolution in that space. And some of the things that emerged out of my lab are now reaching patients in a significant way. So we did a lot of work on a molecule called the T-cell antigen receptor, which is the thing that targets T-cells, which are the function, the mediators of a lot of the functions in the immune system. And a company that came out of my lab 15 years ago called Immunocore is now developed T-cell receptor drugs which target cancers and a whole variety of other drugs, and it can be used in infectious disease, autoimmune disease, and cancer. So that's approaching approval by the regulators within the next year or two. So that's, one of the things, if you're a doctor, nothing is more gratifying than doing something that actually gets to patients and makes a huge difference.
And going through the whole phase, from the basic research all the way to...
And to be clear, it takes a very long time.
Yes.
So that's something that people don't realize. This is a 20-year journey.
Yes, yes. Well, you were talking about how the last 20 years have been so exciting. Looking forward, I know it's hard to predict how long things will take, but what do you predict or anticipate might be some of the breakthroughs?
So I think there are a couple of domains which I am also very interested in. They're not my area of scientific expertise, but I think they're really interesting. One of them, which is a broad agenda, is how do you bring the whole of humanity up to a much higher standard for healthcare? And this is the global health agenda. And of course, Oxford has, I think, arguably the strongest global health program in the UK and in Europe, one of the best in the world. We've nurtured that over a long period of time. It's a really terrific program. And there are still really big obstacles to making progress in the developing world. And as you fix one, other ones backfill, as it were. So there are a whole set of key infectious disease challenges. Malaria is still a big issue, but also the new emerging viral infections are a key issue. But increasingly in developing economies, the epidemic of chronic disease, heart disease, cancer, is now becoming the dominant cause of death. So
it's both.
It's both.
You have,
and mental health, which is a really key issue. So that's one big challenge. The second big challenge is the one I've just mentioned, which is mental health. So diseases wax and wane over history, and what we're seeing now is really an epidemic of mental health disorders. And lots of people have given up because it's quite complicated, because people don't really understand how the brain works, and they don't really understand what mediates these disorders. But in terms of burden of disease globally, the mental health disorders are number one. So you can't sort of say, oh, well, we're not going to work on that. So we've got a program here to really build a very major program in mental health disorders. It's going to be a major initiative that we're running. We're setting up a new campus for mental health in Headington, which will be a 40-acre campus, which will have industry, academia, and the university integrated. So I think it's tractable. It's going to be hard, but I think it is tractable. And I think a bit like global health. When we started doing global health, everyone said, what are you doing that for? You're never going to sort that out. But, we've made a lot of progress. So I think we just have to put our attention in that space. So
tackle the big challenges.
Tackle the big challenges, actually.
Yeah.
And then at a sort of micro level, I think there are two big challenges. As you know, I've been leading for the government on their life sciences industrial strategies. The government's very keen to help support life sciences. And we're doing a number of things which I think are going to help transform and make healthcare systems more efficient. One is we're bringing a lot of AI into healthcare, and of course the NHS is a perfect place to do that because the data sets are terrific. But the second thing we're doing is that if you ask people where is healthcare in a Western setting going to end up over the next 20 years, one of the things that I think many people will say is that we treat most people with disease after they're symptomatic, when the disease is in its latest stages. And as a result, there's a limited number of things you can do. You can palliate, you can reduce symptoms, but it's very difficult to change the course of the disease in a material way. So we're just in the process of setting up a large cohort, which will be 5 million people in the NHS, to identify people who are at high risk of certain subtypes of disease, all the major cancers, cardiovascular disease, inflammatory disorders, and use a whole set of really interesting new technologies to see whether we can detect the disease 5 or 10 years before they actually become symptomatic. So I'll give you an example. Pancreatic cancer, which is a notoriously bad cancer, everybody dies, they die quickly. That disease, we estimate, has been going on in those individuals for 15 years before they present clinically. So you got 15 years, you make the diagnosis early, you can cure most of those people. So I think this is a much more cost-effective way of trying to manage this epidemic of disease, is to try and identify people early.
Yes.
And then you can flatten that morbidity curve over their lifetime. So that's a big ambition. Nobody else can really do it. We're creating that cohort. We just started now. The government's made me the leader of that particular project, so I think it's going to be quite exciting to do that.
That's very exciting.
5 years.
Yeah, and Brexit or no Brexit, that will happen, right?
We shouldn't get detoured into the Brexit discussion, but as I was saying, I think, look, Brexit is Brexit. The university's been here for 1,000 years. We've had much worse than that.
Yes.
It's going to be fine.
It's going to be fine.
It's going to be fine.
Yeah. Well, I was, as you were talking about both the global health equity issues and that shift from treating acute disease to prevention, I was thinking, you are the convener of our upcoming Rhodes Healthcare Forum in early February, and its topic is From Surviving to Thriving, and I think it's very much connected to all these issues.
It is, actually, and I've done this for a few years now, but one of the really interesting things about the Healthcare Forum that we have here every year is that we bring together rather interesting mixes of people. First of all, there's a lot of very bright students, so people like to come to it, but we bring people from healthcare systems, from major international agencies, from industry, and from academia, and it produces a really vibrant mix of discussions, and to be clear, I should take no credit for this whatsoever, because it's all organized by the students, which is terrific. And
which is wonderful.
I
yes.
write a few letters and all the rest of it, but
that helps a lot.
they do cook it up themselves, and it's their agenda, which I think it is a really interesting piece of the forum, and it's a great success for the Rhodes House. Yeah,
it's fantastic, and great, as you say, great for our scholars, for them to be able to cook this up and meet these leaders, everything. That's wonderful. So tell me a bit more about the sort of the story of Oxford Medical Sciences, which is, of course, rankings vary, but I mean, it's certainly one of the very, very top in the world. What makes it top of the world, and how did that happen? How did that come together?
Yeah, so people forget that there's in a sort of Oxford slightly hopeless, totally disorganized way. We've had really stunning scientists in Oxford over centuries, and I'll name two because they really are. Well, I'll name two or three. But William Osler was really the father of the way we practice medicine. He had my job for 15 years. At the beginning of the last century, and wrote his textbook here, and was a huge influence in the way bedside medicine evolved based on very clear diagnostics. And then in his day, he didn't have many therapeutics, but it was a really diagnostic focused medicine, and that was a major step. What most people don't know is that his successor was a guy named Archibald Garrod, and Archibald Garrod was a really brilliant clinician scientist who's actually only recently been, I think, widely recognized for his contributions. But it was he who made the link between genetics and disease, which is an amazing result. And he made it for rare diseases where you had single genes that got wonky. But he also made the link between common diseases. Asthma was the thing he was interested in. And he noticed that asthma both had an environmental component, because lots of people started to wheeze in the spring and they didn't wheeze in the winter, and it was associated with pollen and those environmental exposures. But he also recognized that clustered in families. So without any of the tools, he didn't know what DNA was at that stage. He really did all that stuff. So these are really brilliant people that really changed the course of medicine. And then George Pickering, who also had this job some years ago, was the first person to really define hypertension as a disease. So that got us into the how do quantitative traits, where there's a distribution of blood pressure, but the people at one extreme of the distribution get trouble. It was he who really thought all that through. And then, of course, Richard Dahl, who was the person who described the link between smoking and cancer, was the father of epidemiology and cohorts and all that kind of stuff. So you know, Oxford has nothing to apologize for its history. It was just totally disorganized. Smart people popped up and did good things, which is actually a good thing. When Richard Dahl was Regis Professor, he made a couple of really key appointments. He recruited a guy named David Weatherall, who sadly just died a few weeks ago, and an Australian professor by the name of Peter Morris. And although Richard Dahl was an epidemiologist, he definitely had an eye for really talented leaders. And those guys came in and said, actually, this world of medicine is going to go molecular, because we're going to start to be able to pick apart what's going on at a cellular level and at a genetic level. And I think those two, more than any, set up a platform in Oxford to actually evolve and develop at that molecular level. And of course, Richard Dahl's influence kept us going at a population level. So we had this really interesting population expertise, but also molecular expertise. Peter was an transplant immunologist, and David was a geneticist. So that was the platform, and that's actually where the fundamental pillars of Oxford medicine came from. They don't, because it's all glitzy these days, they don't often get the credit they deserve, but I have to tell you, that's really where it started. And for example, our global health program, David Weatherall started our global health program, and he started it in the mid-70s. So, you know, that was long before Bill Gates made any money. You know, it was really fundamental. And then the breakthrough came in the UK around a couple of key events. One was the Wellcome Trust, which owned the whole of the Wellcome pharmaceutical company, sold its shares to Glaxo in 1992. And they brought in an endowment of £12 billion, which was a ton of money. And of course, there was a certain amount of government funding that had loped along. It had gone up and down. But we couldn't, without the resource, we couldn't have built Oxford Medicine without a substantial amount of resource. We're still the largest recipient of Wellcome funds in the country. It's been a huge driver, and that actually started to allow us to be much more expansive in our thinking. So I had just taken over the chair of medicine, not my current chair, but the Nuffield Chair of Medicine in 1992. And we had this opportunity to actually start to build research institutes, expand our capabilities, bring in lots of new faculty. So we used that opportunity to really skate hard. And we made a couple, and I say we because it wasn't me, but I was involved in these decisions. We made a couple of really key strategic decisions. So one of the things in medicine, as in everything else, you've got to make some bets. And they won't all work out. So, and it's not a space for the faint-hearted. You just got to do it. So in 1991, when I took the chair, I wrote a letter to the Wellcome Trust, and I said, I think genetics is going to have a huge influence on our understanding of disease. And not just rare diseases like cystic fibrosis, but all diseases, cancer, cardiovascular disease, inflammatory diseases. And I'd like to set up a big center in Oxford to tackle that problem. And of course, they just cashed in, so they had a bit of money. And they sent up some people around to talk to us, all of whom said, really? That sounds a bit unlikely. But we managed to assemble an international team of scientists that were as good as anybody else had. And Wellcome were in a mood to punt, and we were in a mood to punt. So we built the Wellcome Trust Center for Human Genetics. Well, you know, and then we began the job of trying to work out how all that worked. And let me tell you, it has taken a very long time. But, you know, just in the last year, largely due to the scientists that have been operating in the Wellcome Trust Center and the UK Biobank project, which I described a minute ago, we had scale, we had very large numbers of samples, 500,000 samples, and we had the smartest statistical geneticists on the planet. And out of that came an understanding that for every disease, there are hundreds of genetic loci or genetic variants that mediate risk of that disease. And when you add them all up, you can actually identify people who are at very high risk of every one of the common diseases. And this is the so-called polygenic risk score.
Right.
And this is a game changer because it changes public health, because I can say to you, you are at very high risk of this cancer, but not of that cancer. You're at very high risk cardiovascular disease, but not inflammatory disease. And as a result, you can target medicine in a way we could never do it before. And anyway, that's the journey, 1991 to now. That's how long it took us. But I don't think anybody would dispute that Oxford was at the lead in that whole process, which is a great story.
It's a great story, and kind of making that big bet
Exactly.
It makes me think. You said a minute ago that now you all are making a big bet with mental health.
That's right.
And it's the same sort of thing. It may take 20 years, but making that investment.
And that's exactly what you have to do. You have to decide when is, because if you'd made a bet on mental health 20 years ago, you would have made zero progress. Mm-hmm. So some of this is timing. Yeah. And then, of course, the other thing about this is people. Mm-hmm. So I'm a real believer that, we built this enormous campus up the hill. It's got 3,000 people on it. It's all biomedical research, lots of glitzy building and all that stuff. But the truth is, it's all about the people in the buildings, and it's not about the buildings. And we've been very lucky because Oxford has this terrific draw for outstanding scientists all over the world. So we can recruit the absolutely very best people to come and help us work on these really challenging problems. And one of the most gratifying things for me as one of the strategists that sit behind it is finding the people to come,
yes,
and then backing them when they're here to actually make real progress. And that's been terrific. And to be clear, a number of those people are Rhodes Scholars, which is rather nice to have as well. But I should also say that, the opportunity for me to operate in this space at a high strategic level started with the Rhodes Scholarship. So, there's no question that opened doors and opened my eyes to challenges and opportunities that I would never have had I not come to Oxford in 1975.
Yeah. Well, one last question, really related to what you were just saying. Is if you're talking to a prospective Rhodes Scholar or a young person who's interested in medical sciences, what would your advice be to them about how they should approach their careers, given what an amazing career you're in the midst of? How they should approach their careers, and why come to Oxford?
Yeah. So I'm not surprisingly, I do this a bit, and I think. One of the things I try and point out to bright, young, able kids, and one of the interesting things is the pressure for people to do medicine, which was very strong in my day. It was really hard to get into medical school. It was hard to get into a good lab. That hasn't subsided at all. People, I think there is something very attractive of this really exciting mix of cutting-edge science, but also knowing that if you succeed, you're going to change people's health, you'll fundamentally change people's lives with interventions that come out of what you do. I mean, it's pretty exciting. And, I don't want to downplay astronomers. Astronomers are terrific. Mm-hmm. But, spot a new star, it's kind of helpful, but it doesn't have the impact, to be honest, of what you can do in a medical arena. So I think the question I say to them, I ask them is, do you believe that the changes we've seen in the last 30 years of medicine, which I've experienced, can be perpetuated and extended for the next 30 years, because there's no shortage of ill health, premature death out there. So there's no shortage of challenges. And in fact, the challenges to medicine are going to be partly that we've been so successful because we're now living in a world of the 100-year life. Mm-hmm. So everyone born today in the UK has a 54% chance of living to 100. Mm-hmm. Well, that changes everything. Oh my goodness me! It changes the way you
policy
run
around retirement and pensions.
So nothing works.
Yes.
Retirement doesn't work. Pensions don't work. Education doesn't work. Jobs don't work. Marriage doesn't work. Nothing works. So we have precipitated one of the great challenges for mankind by shifting demography out at the pace we have. And to be, as an aside, without us, there wouldn't have been Brexit. Because all those old guys who voted to leave, they're alive because we gave them an extra 10 years of life. So you could argue that we're the source of lots of issues. Now,
you're to blame.
Let's put it this way. We may have created the opportunity of Brexit.
Yes.
That's probably a more polite way to put it. But you can see that this is having quite a profound effect on society widely. And I think unless you manage all those other things,
yes,
you're going to find that there's people saying, well, hang on, you know, what exactly are we doing here? So I think it's the next 30 years is going to be rather than the pure play science agenda, there's going to be a much more important mix of social sciences, humanities, how do we organize society, how do we deal with the advances that we'll get in these domains.
Yeah, what are our moral obligations to one another? So from the humanities through the social sciences.
And what are the ethics of doing this compared to that? And, you know, I think that was never a main, in my career, I was always interested in that, but it was never a main or dominant theme. I think it will become increasingly a dominant theme because the impacts are going to be large. And the same will apply in global health because, you know, inequities are going to exist. How are you going to manage the inequities? How are you going to try and reduce the inequities in an ever-changing medical environment on a global scale? That will be a big challenge.
Yes. It's a wonderful challenge to all of the Rhodes Scholars, actually, since they work on so many different questions and issues. What an extraordinary conversation, what an extraordinary life and career. Sir John Bell, thank you so much for being a part of this Rhodes Ahead and for sharing so much food for thought for all of us. And thank you all for listening in.